Hello everyone, new Q&A episode. Today we hadn't been making this from a while. There isn't any specific strategy to it. There are naturally many questions that I receive. Some are very interesting, yet you can never fully know what's the ultimate criterion that I will choose to answer them in order. Obviously some will not go answered. Others, of course, I promise also to answer. They do not even go in chronological order. Today we get faith and flesh, religion as ethno-national marker. So if you remember, last spring I received a series of questions, like machine gun rate of fire, from a Southeast Asian American who is very interested in this kind of aspect, say, of national identity in ancient and medieval times and beyond. In fact, today's video expands also in modern contemporary era. These questions have always been very interesting. They're very sort of polished, researched. There is a lot of work behind them. It's not much that of course, I appreciate, but again, it's not per se the criterion why I answer them. It's really the fact that I feel them to be properly resonating with the purpose of the channel. In a way, I can also answer or also disagree, in fact, with some things that, some premises, if anything, especially about what I personally believe, from actually a dedicated follower that I haven't really identified in anywhere else, like on the social media, but that has written me a couple of times now for me to appreciate this message. Again, I'm going to answer more, just if anything, an advice for anyone, like in a very generic, neutral way. Tend to say, if you see that I have already discussed something, not in the sense of like this or that specific video, but if you can expect that your question, that your curiosity can be answered, satisfied by just watching a bit more of my videos on a given topic, please search in the channel. I'm sure you can find always, wherever you are, something that you didn't really think I covered and that interests you more. There is the search function on YouTube. It's really good. On Schwerpunkt we care about discipline, so it's really a good principle to follow in general, and it makes things more interesting, because at that point, if you still have a curiosity, there is some sort of more nuanced vision behind this all. It's not much the case of this the author of this particular series of questions, because there are some things that I covered, but let's say he comes from probably an angle that it's not like I don't cover, but that I hardly explicitate. And in fact, while I was reading the question today, I said, well, there are certain aspects that I objectively had never explained on Schwerpunkt that can in fact now be done through this demand. So I'll simply read this. Consider, to the author of the question, consider yourself extremely spoiled for me to answer your specific questions with this dedication. So, dear Schwerpunkt, thank you again for your posting a variety of detailed and in-depth content on different historical subjects. I have returned to you again to ask about another theme I see across history. I hope you find this topic to be as interesting as I do. In the years preceding my early adulthood, I understood a nation's identity to be defined by an ancestral bedrock. Yet through cultural osmosis, it became apparent to me that religion was also important to a nation's identity. Buddhism in East Asia, Hinduism in India, etc. Initially, I learned that synonymizing religions and ethnicities can be ignorant and simplistic. Ironically, as I grew older and deepened my understanding of history, I was surprised to learn that there are, in fact, religions that play a syncretic role in ethnic identity. I would add, as Schwerpunkt here, that is actually the ultimate point of traditional spirituality, and in a sense, in a truly universal sense, which does not mean an extension of this, an awful extension of this standard, but mostly from the personal standpoint that sort of rises above, in fact, the masses being ever more exclusive. Because the notion, of course, is that you have to upgrade, and most people kind of don't. But continuing with the question, it was interesting to learn how Greeks understood Turkish people to be Islamicized Anatolians, or that Mennonites and Druze were ethno-religious groups, quote-unquote. what became clear was that nationhood and ethnicity, while defined by lineage, are also bound by shared values. This is something silently understood but often forgotten. I'm interested as a Schwerpunkt to read this because it's incredibly frequent. But I would add, for example, on X, etc., to see what would be conventionally called extremistic sort of individuals, considering at least what is today's political, I hate the term, say the mainstream political beliefs, that stress very much, especially in a racialistic sense, the idea that essentially if something does not belong to your culture, to your race, is alien and somehow unfit and or inferior, hardly the point is ever made for superiority. All right, that's an interesting aspect because, as you see, the question will arrive to some of those, if anything, general political questions regarding the current state of, for example, the political ideas in the United States and so on. So it's something to bear in mind in all this, because it's actually the most interesting part of the question that sort of escalates in interest given the topics that are provided. Now, the two aspects, I continue reading the question, the two aspects of faith and flesh linger in the background of nationhood, upholding and conflicting with one another at various intervals. By the way, I'm still thinking, because I haven't, as you know, I don't prepare a script or anything to answer this stuff. I would add, by the way, that I also believe that there is actually a connection between the two things. I believe that it's physical as metaphysical, and so all-encompassing. The problem is, again, where's individual agency in this, and on the basis of that same difference, right? Because, as I often say, if it were just some sort of zoological materialism / determinism, every people would always do just the same thing and others wouldn't. But even in front of any overarching factor, right, at that point, what is dominant, really? Of course, you could say, well, things like race, human groups are somehow limited. Yes, but tradition, in its probably universal meaning, says that you must transcend that everything, really, if you want to achieve divinity. And in a national lens, in this sense, also elevating your own people to an unprecedented metaphysical height, right? Which is deeply in line with also with in the opposite direction with the concept of the fall that too many, I think, ethno-nationalists seem to sort of simply surpass by saying, well, okay, just go back to look at this, my version, my understanding of what the past was, in a sort of radical, tranchant manner, except all these people have different ideas because they're also falling in different ways. And most of the times they have incredibly post-traditional understanding, in fact, of what they think tradition would be. And that's sort of painful enough because it never takes into account actual merit or individual capacity or how to achieve it, which is the entire problem. It's just like some sort of aestheticistic emotionalism for Twitter posts and not actually a thorough spiritual cultivation. Personally, I try to bring something on the table that can be useful for people in that direction, because whenever I talk tradition, I'm talking essentially about this, right? And at this point, it's just essentially, and we'll get to that point because we talk a lot about the United States here, I think American identitarism, communitarism, I mean, it's something stemming, in fact, from a very precise post-traditional world that may surely, be a reaction also to the particular sort of multicultural background of the United States, with, of course, the notion, as we'll see now, that, of course, there was a primigenial dominant force, but say, for a colonial country like that, it's also a bit difficult to make the case. Yes, surely, Protestant, white, English, there is no doubt, right? But it still, in this sense, does not, in historical times, offer like an absolute, right, standard, and it does not cope with also what was, for example, the same British homeland, what had happened in history before the birth of the United States. So it's something which people tend to take in just a purely identitaristic fashion without basically understanding anything with what they should do with that. And it's starting to become really tiring because, it gets nowhere. You keep beating around the bush without, pointed out the biggest of the many elephants in the room, namely the fact that you're mortal and you're, tweeting BS, without achieving any transcendence whatsoever. So I would think about that. So continuing with the question, having been raised by a fiercely Protestant father, this is very interesting. Father is with capital F here, who was also a church leader. My identity was strongly affirmed in the faith my parents lent to me. Being a child of among refugees, my parents made sure to educate me about my culture of origin. I would frequent a monk church on the weekends and go to school where everyone was predominantly white. While I did face a certain degree of prejudice, it was never anything too severe. My time was well spent among all the different collectives I sojourned about. You can imagine, Dan, the confusion I faced when watching history documentaries about white nationalism rife with Christian imagery throughout these movements. As if my prepubescent mind was not perplexed enough, the final straw anti-Semitism compounded on the heap of bigotry already present, leaving a puzzling mark on the bizarre nature of religion, race, and nationhood. So it's getting political, but it makes it interesting. Again, the best comes at the end. So he says, as I gained an enthusiasm for history during my early college years, I could not shake off the ethno-religious dichotomy that presented itself in nearly every historic topic I studied. So this, I understand, happened in the United States, as he also said later that he is from there. Thus I have compiled a list for you to dissect at your leisure. And so here begins the list of very sort of specific ethno-national religious contexts in history with very specific questions to answer. So I don't know what's the strategy of this guy when he poses this question, because we have already addressed this back and forth thoroughly back in spring, if you remember. But of course, I think that if you can fish like with a wide net, like you inject just stuff, I will have to answer. I'm pretty meticulous and conscientious, so I tend, like if I have to answer this question, to look at everything, also because I really want to understand the whole philosophy, sort of the whole bottom line. So it starts. So I will make this premise. These first two topics are interesting, absolutely, but they're the least interesting of the whole. I really had fun in the end. For all the, I must say, the unhinged level of sort of political, ethnic, religious mix that was presented, and it was fun, and we will try to untangle this. It's I think exactly the effect that this question was aimed to elicit. So it starts with, and it's very wide, if you remember from last spring, this varies a lot. It starts with Arabs and the definition of ethnicity. So this is more a statement than a question. Either he forgot to make the question in this paragraph, but it's essentially talking about my idea of Arabs through my mostly medieval history videos. We'll see how it goes. The definition of what, so he says, an ethnicity may differ depending on who you ask. Ethnicity is often defined as either a lineage-based identity or a cultural one. If you were to define the quote-unquote Arab as an ancestral background, as I see you do, it's true that, so I as a Schwerpunkt do, it's true that only peninsular Arabs would be considered as such. However, he says, I tend to lean more to the other way, though I should specify that I'm not accusing you of any malintent. Oh my God. I believe Arab exists as a valid identity if you were to define it as a cultural linguistic construct. The Arabs are also no exception to this label. We see the same label of quote-unquote Goth applied to an amalgamation of peoples who exhibited notable Sarmatian influences and others with a Germanic core. The label quote-unquote Slav was also a broad ethnic marker for a people that shared a common language and material culture who were likely more heterogeneous than we often think. It should come as no surprise then that Egypt, one of the most distinct non-Arab populations, would later declare itself and be acknowledged as the leader of the Arab world in the modern age. The Persians, interestingly, paralleled the Germanic Aryan heresy by drawing themselves close to the Islamic world, while proclaiming themselves Shia. On the latter point, as Schwerpunkt, I would add that it's a bit different in theological terms. Of course, I'm not claiming that this was the point made by the question, but it's also, let's say, since we're talking about cultural identity, let's say that the German Aryan identity was sort of imperfect, right? Aryanism was adopted as a creed, mostly for very tactical reasons in relation with Rome. Most Germans didn't even really think that to be Aryan Christians in that sense. And although there is something about probably their worldview regarding the sort of non-divine nature of Christ, and there is in there, if anything, something else that in fact is disconnected, I think, or is directly connected actually with how the Romans would see this, preferably. But it's not much, it's a sort of a broader belief, right? There were also other peoples who likely thought the same, and it's a bit difficult to entangle this from the historical sources of the era. However, if anything, we will see better at another point. So continuing with the question, it says, we can see many examples of history, of this throughout history, but Iran appears as the modern apex of such an anomaly. Here we see, well, if you think about it, it's not really an anomaly, because you're saying that basically the Islamic world does not equate to be Arab. So yeah, it seems also relatively normal. Here it says we see religion being used to define nation/ethnicity as opposed to being personalized in belief or of an individual. Yes, however, take in consideration that that Persia was taken over by the Arabs in a sort of broader political dynastic sense, and so the Shia sect of Islam is definitely resonant with Iranian ethos, spirituality to an important degree, but it's also something that at that point, in fact, stemmed from a very specific, as you know, event in early Islamic history, rather than being necessarily just how those peoples had to cultivate their own view. If anything, it's also because they were some sort of backwater at that point, as the Middle East, at least say better, the Levant and some of the most developed areas also in Mesopotamia, actually in between the Near and the Middle East, were hegemonized by Arab Sunni rulers, right? Regardless of all the influence that came from Persia as a cultural superpower in the region. In any case, this is not so useful for the question, because it's not even a question. He goes on and says, whereas other Muslim nations may struggle with the validity of their Arabic Islamic identity, Iran has managed to weave a definitive answer. While I don't necessarily disagree with defining an ethnic group by a genetic backbone, I often feel the cultural component is understated when it comes down to understanding ethnography and state formation. So yeah, I agree, and I would, since you say that I mostly use the term Arab probably in an ancestral sense, I'm pretty flexible. It depends on what we're talking about. If we were to talk, I don't know, the 20th century, obviously I would use the term Arab for lots of countries that have historically, but sort of language and religion to do with the Arabo-Islamic conquest of the 7th century. If I use the term Arab, usually, because I haven't really made a whole lot of Arabian history videos, and most of the times I talked about them, I talked about Arabized elites of the Berbers who took over Spain, they destroyed the Visigoths, to stress, in fact, there was some important detachment, like even though these were to become, and this was an early era in which maybe not even the Arabs, to some extent, would have become Muslim, if we think about that. This happened a bit later, but I mean, if you think before the Battle of Yarmouk, Islam was very young as a faith. A Byzantine victory could have actually aborted this movement, the phenomenon that we would probably not even know much about at that point. So if I have to stress, of course, the differences between the Arabs and the Turks, so to say, there I extend the notion of Arab world as mostly whatever was taken over by the Caliphate and at some point infested and taken over by the Turks. So it really depends. I don't really overly stress Arab ancestry per se. Actually, when I talk about the Caliphate, I use it mostly as you do. So again, all fine, but in fact, I'm definitely flexible in that sense. It really depends on what I'm teaching for what, in which context, right? Then, second point, Bosnia religion as an ethnic marker. he says, while the Serbs fell under the influence of the Greek and the Croats fell under the Franks, the Bosnians were ostracized by both churches. Their supposed heresies eventually caused the Pope to call for a crusade by which the Hungarians acted as their vessel of war. Although the Bosnians were meant to adhere to the Latin Church, they opted to establish their own autocephalous institution. It's not really fully true that they were an autocephalous institution, but the bottom line of all this is that Bosnia was so politically inconsistent to a degree that as a frontier area, as a fringe, could not even have such institutional stability to begin with. I started a series about early medieval Bosnia. You can sort of easily identify what Bosnia is at some point, but evidently, as this example also proves, things were pretty flowing. So he says, how were the Franks able to influence the Croats and Slovenes so early on, but not the Bosnians? So I'll answer question by question here. The reason why that happened is that Bosnia was sort of more distant, right? You can argue this was there, in fact, in between what was Frankish and what was Byzantine from the other side. There is, if we talk to the Franks, also in later times, we're really looking, as you said also with the Crusade, the Hungarians that were Roman Catholic being able to enforce their control on Croatia and Slovenia, that were sort of also closer to civilization, closer to the same Hungary from the other side, because we don't consider Hungary civilization, of course, or well, it was becoming exactly because it was essentially a Franco-Roman influence part of Europe, and actually siding with that religious axis, so to say. So the reason why the Byzantines were unable to assert the religion onto the Bosnians is that first of all, it's not like the Bosnians didn't have they had some deviant sects of heretical groups in as much as they were French, right? So certain dynamics of this kind happen, for example, in southeastern Anatolia for Islam. It's the same identical thing, right? The fringe is more ideologically extreme by definition, and it's the receptacle of all these kind of, delinquents, criminals, agitators, violent individuals, and so on, right? And if you look at, for example, the history of Serbia has some interest as a also bigger land to be fully co-opted, to in fact have, at the end of the day, some autonomous power, because the Byzantines can't control the Balkan hinterland. They don't even look properly forward to that. Like they, if anything, are content to regain control of the coast, and from there sort of obliging the hinterland to depend on them in a sort of way, and gradually, culturally, politically absorbing them. But definitely in Byzantine culture, nothing like an actual continental colonization of those worlds. And Bosnia is, in this sense, extremely peripheral, because from the Adriatic part, you have the Dinaric Alps. It's also sealed off. In the south, you have the Balkans, and this region is properly external, sort of poor, impervious, and that's basically the reason why this happened, right? You may be, not maybe you as the author of the question, but in general, like people to be surprised by how sort of underdeveloped in general the Balkans historically were, even before, in fact, the Ottoman conquest. Going on with the question, if the Bosnian Church was able to establish some sort of autocephaly, why did the Croats and Slovenes not attempt to do the same? Because again, they were closer to civilization, to Italy, to Germany, to Hungary, right? That's basically the reason. And they had, again, an interest to be properly recognized as within that game as individual polities, because this saved them a little bit from external interference. In Bosnia, the neighbors were not so thrilled to simply conquer this land because it wasn't much. And in any case, they also were normally part of the fringe, and this land within the outer, the highest fringe, so to say, seemed even not so particularly relevant, and was part of game of political instability. If you look at the Serbs, the Croats, and so on, it's not like those states were particularly, shining for political cohesion, for that matter. Continuing the question, there also appears to be a contested debate on the ethnogenesis of the Bosnians. And here it's meant in a modern sense, like given that you are making videos on medieval Bosnia, I imagine that you affirm their identity existed before the age of nationalism. Yeah, I mean, for the Balkans, it's like, I don't know, those people's, the Macedonians, like how do you, it's not much about the fact of saying, this people was more from the side that today we can clearly identify as a modern country. Either Serbia, Croatia, Bulgaria, whatever. It's the fact that at the time, of course, a level of local identity existed on that base, and you can't call it, in fact, here I appreciate the question, it says simple identity, right? Without even throwing in nationhood per se. Here it's mostly religion, if you understand clearly. He says, both Croats and Serbians claim Bosnians to be of their own kin, which have been robbed from them by Islam. And that's, in fact, the elephant in the room in this case, because probably the Turks called the Bosniaks those Islamic landowners in this area that thus were also a bit like the backbone, aside from the irregular and very sort of interspersed, like ethno-religious blending in this Balkan hinterland, the actual basis for the Islamic identity of at least parts of Bosnia. So, and that's, in fact, two different things, and more things actually overlapping. So he says, out of the four South Slavic groups, Bosnian identity, as far as I understand, seemed to dissipate under colonial rule, only to reemerge under the age of nationalism. Help me rectify this view. Why was the Bosnian identity most abstract during Ottoman Habsburg colonization compared to the outer South Slavs? Or was it just as evenly conspicuous? Well, it's what I was saying before. Like if you watch, for example, my other videos on medieval Balkan peoples, there, what we really try to assess, also for any other polity that we cover for the regional series, how truly conspicuous this polities really were in terms of cohesion and power. Like we don't reason much in terms of there was a pre-existing layer of national or whatever proto-national identity that you can't parcel out simply on a geographical basis. It's mostly what did it mean to eventually identify with this polity or another, and how intense was that, right? So it's obvious that, during the Ottoman Habsburg era, well, the Habsburgs had sort of a very specific recognition of the Bosnia, as much as the Turks had, basically. But it's obvious that as any people, and especially in that sort of nightmarish cauldron of the Balkans that became, as you know, the par excellence, the term also that indicating political, in fact, Balkanization, parcelization, fragmentation, and even a greater interspersion, entwining of almost indestructible identities, religious, ethnic, whatever. There would be reactivation of Bosnia, as much as, of course, the pattern of political national statal development that is in general aligning with the development of 19th century countries in general at the time. This can be made for many other countries, also bigger ones. In a sense, this local polities, exactly because they had to remain, say, if, let's make an example, Serbia had fenced off the Ottomans or something, likely today we wouldn't be talking about Bosnians very much. We would just think about Bosnia as a province within the broader Serbian world, and most people wouldn't even know or hear. Then because of the war in the later 20th century, everybody knows Bosnia because it's sort of a name that evokes all the malaise and the sort of the disaster that came out of that. But let's say it really depends. Like so many sort of, in this sense, identities are eventually subsumed and or subordinated to bigger ones simply because there is a greater power that was able to hegemonize everything. The Balkans, by definition, were never something like that, right? Or they could have been at some point in history, but they turned out what they were. So it's not so strange, after all, that these peoples would try to maintain their own kind of local mentality. And there would be much to say about this also in a general part. I mean, you do not emerge psychologically stable from centuries of Ottoman domination to begin with. And in general, you see how the Balkans could prove this up to very recent times. And so that's basically why also almost the paranoia, the idea of who was going to take advantage of us next. This is something very pronounced also, and especially in the post-socialist Europe, like this idea that you as a national identity are basically characterized by the fact that you are living in a fog of war where enemies spring out of the darkness at every single instant, that you basically do not understand anything about the world or anything around you except that you are you because somebody told you that you are you, right? That's basically it. It's something much less cultivated, much less sort of built up than other countries' histories, including, interestingly enough, countries that were politically divided for a long time, and that, however, had already developed a clear national identity before that, right? And so at a provincial level, definitely there is a Bosnian identity that you can identify also in the Middle Ages. Then the importance that you want to give to it depends, right? And that's where, whenever you make these videos about the Balkans, there are people tearing each other apart in the comments, which is one of the few instances in which I let the thing run wildly without checks, because at the end of the day, I think it's important to highlight mostly the malaise behind this whole rather than any kind of deeper historical debate, right? And so he says, was Bosnian identity something which had been unearthed for the modern state? And if so, how did this take place? Not 100%. We could, of course, talk endlessly. I have a series on the Habsburgs, if anything, can look at this more thoroughly. But obviously, there were some specific political choices at some point in history whereby countries were redrawn for also foreign interest, strategy, etc. This happened very much in the Balkans as well. So there is surely a component of that. And surely many of these countries' national identities were reforged, rebranded, if you want, for a modern case of political independence. However, it's not like they hadn't existed in a broader sense. And there are sort of many. Think about Romania. Romania is very interesting in that regard. How do you explain the history of... You see, this has nothing to do, let's say, with, paradigmatically speaking, with Western Europe. Right, for Western Europe, basically from antiquity, you have this very specifically outlined regional boundaries that regardless, of course, the sort of the absence of a modern political identity, where fundamentally that has broader pools of culture, of ethnos, and so on. And they went on like this. In these other countries, the more east you go, in Europe, the more labile it is. It's more recent, it's more constructed. But I would also like to stress regarding this that I find it very important, and I have really a great respect towards the concept of contemporary nationhood. Right? I don't see it something. It depends on what use you do of that. But let's say, especially for countries that had terrible histories. Think about Ukraine, and the fact that there is the acknowledgement of a specific choice of field, so to say, regarding who you are, what's your role, what your role should be in the world, and how much you're willing to strive for that, I think is very important. It's something that at some point transcend ethnos, just to connect with what we were saying before. For example, I don't know, with there are all the... Given that we're talking about Yugoslavia, there were, at the time of the 20th century, all the issues that happened, for example, with the Italians, right? Think about Dalmatia, Istria, those lands. There were some Slavs that decided during the various, especially after World War II, what happened with Italy losing territory on the eastern side of the Adriatic, that some local Slavic people that were not ethnic Italians, by history, by culture, preferred to an extent, to identify as Italian citizens, and in that sense, placing their own Italian identity above also their own ethnocultural one. Because again, and I can't open the parenthesis on, in this sense, why I have also the aforementioned respect towards this specific field of choice, but in a also sort of strategic sense, Clausewitzionally speaking, I think that fragmentation is actually a marker of weakness, right? Unless you're able to federatively behave in a very cohesive way, while, say, maintaining your local identity while at the same time using that to compact power with others, you're not an advanced culture. You're failing at something, right? And this is definitely what happened in the Balkans, and also with the Serbian attempt to recover other territories, whatever. And it's not like it wasn't a matter of also some degree of national pride and, of course, also previous political ambition, whatever. It's mostly about the fact that not just they failed, but they failed because they were essentially stepping over the decision of other peoples that could have simply obtained more by through some greater cooperation. And naturally, obviously, when in between there is religion, there is some historical divide, like with Bosnia, etc., it's obvious that genocidal histories arise, right? And so that's, for example, an incredibly delicate part of history. It's not like you can simply say, in absolute terms, this people was completely wrong or this other completely right. There is obviously a very clear, absolute moral divide, and it can't be denied. It doesn't mean to make moral relativism, but it's like when you evaluate politics, identity, warfare, culture, there is never such a thing like an absolute 100% evil. Whatever these guys did was wrong by definition. In a way that is truly expendable in a moral and scientific sense, right? I think in history, on a history book. Again, this has nothing to do with rehabilitate those who failed and were doing that because they were wrong about what we're doing. And that's how things really work at large. We also must recover this realization that power is power because it works. All right, and even when this comes at the expense of entire peoples, it's never something that you can wholly blame or sometimes even entirely blame. If you think about colonialism, for example, on those who on those who took over. On the contrary, like in many cases, there is also a doubt. And I think also as a military historian that when a country is able to stand their ground on their own and also receive the support of others, for that matter, there is something, right? There is something in terms of civilization, and that's the actual ground on which you decide eventually how history goes, because many people were literally cancelled historically through this process, and in part also through the process of, however, integration, unification, and so at some point a realization that this broader force, regardless of how all the mistakes of how this stuff was done, was at the end of the day more advantageous for the whole than actually for had things remained sort of parceled into tiny bits, right? But if these tiny bits survive at some point, there's also a reason that must be, in this sense, clearly investigated. Then, third paragraph, Spain, limpieza de sangre, lineage as a religious marker. After the success of the Reconquista, there was a need for Iberian monarchs to solidify control of their state. It was here that a policy known as limpieza de sangre was carried out to verify a person's faith by means of their heritage. Those in the north were considered to be clean and undefiled by the blood of Moors and Jews. But those in the south were considered untrustworthy and discriminated against. With this being said, how widespread was this policy and how strictly was it enforced? How long was it enforced? Well, I understand these laws were carried out for pragmatic reasons. How did this reflect in a theological sense? The very interesting question. First of all, the last restrictions were really abandoned in the 19th century that I'm aware of. Naturally, they were more intense up to the 17th. Largely, the Moriscos uprisings were something also because the Ottomans routinely sort of visited the Spanish Mediterranean coast to literally support these uprisings. What I find fascinating is, of course, it can also work as an answer, is the term limpieza de sangre as well, which means purity of blood, right? So this is purity of blood, but it's intended in a merely religious sense, right? So there you have actually a very traditional character of the Reconquista, that divine power is redemptional and transfigurational. And so if you basically act in the right way, you convert to the right faith, you will actually, say, next to what you can do, what is really required for that, you will be saved, you will be eligible for that, right? So theologically speaking, it makes much sense exactly in that mentality, and as much as it is pragmatic, because after all, what do? You start massacring people, just in, like, Moors and Jews had been present everywhere, also in the north, for that matter, also in very consistent communities, so that's not much of a divide you can draw in Spain, without considering that historically that had been largely a matter of faith, meaning that it's not like the Arabs. Yes, the Arabs in Spain brought lots of people, as we were saying before, also North Africans, etc. But most of the Iberian world, even in the south, was made by Europeans, by Spaniards. So regardless of religious divide, there was some specific proximity also of these cultures. And yes, the Iberian Peninsula is very complex, it's very articulated. Surely you can see the outcome of this, like southern Spain. It's just like, I don't know, southern Italy is still at the level of post-socialist Europe in terms of some of the poorest areas of Europe. In part, it has to do with, well, okay, southern Italy is another story, but even there, of course, there were similar mechanisms that weren't, however, much what happened in Spain, also in terms of probably the depression of Andalusia, that historically, in fact, I don't know, southern Italy up to the 18th century, by European standards, was even still a sort of rich place. Now, how did church authorities beyond Spain view this practice? Well, they were actually the ones carrying that out. In fact, I think that the first end of this began with the Inquisition. Like, when the Inquisition stopped doing what it was doing, and that was the first step properly to put an end to these discriminations. And he says, how would the Mozart population have been perceived in this paradigm? Well, definitely as you described, like, there was a general sense of distrust. It's difficult to enter, really, this world, because regardless of the fact it's Western Europe, it's not really a very documented area. I mean, when you study Spanish history, medieval Spanish history, and also Europe in general compared to other cultures, realize that in Europe, our broader Latin, Germanic, later also Slavic, as long as it was, in fact, evangelized and sort of civilized cultures, really wrote a freaking lot, right? We have this weird idea that for some reason, at some point, the Byzantines or the Arabs were sort of more educated, more thriving in a cultural sense than the West. The more I've studied history, the more I've come to realize this is a massive scam that may have well been enforced for some anti-Western Marxist reasons in universities after World War II, right? And so, indeed, it's very difficult within the same Spain to document whatever was happening in the South. I think this was a follower of mine who commented on a video that basically we don't know and you could find the comments, I think, in the video about the Kingdom of Valencia, right? That we do not even know exactly what were the dialects spoken in Islamic Spain. And for a long while, also after these places were reconquered by Christians, like probably the social cultural fabric was devoid of the same level of literary output, educational sort of culture that instead existed through sort of the broader Frankish civilization that had been informing northern Spain, the Christian world, like a connection with Rome, etc. So I'm sure that for, I don't know, Renaissance Spain, there are sources and the topic can be profitably studied, but I don't think like we have like an overwhelming amount of descriptions of how the Mozart population would have probably been perceived. There is some overall lot of that, but it's more something you can find also in other, I don't know, even in chivalric literature towards, I don't know, the Siculo-Normans who were considered like the Poulain de Bataille by the French, the German Crusaders in the High Middle Ages. simply because of the proximity with the infidels, right? And interestingly enough, if you read 1000 and a Night, which emanates from Baghdad, so from the top of caliphal culture, you know that the wizard, the witchcraft, sort of the barely Islamicized lands of North Africa are basically considered in the same identical way. Those were the savages, right? And as such, they weren't even particularly devil. I'm not claiming that, of course, like southern Spain was like northern Africa in a sense. Of course, there were deep connections, especially in the Islamic era, but, right, even for the more advanced Spanish part of these lands, we do not maybe have too much about the Moor, right? It's something that it gets exorcised also later. For example, like everybody hated them during the Reconquista. Then you see during the 16th, 17th century, like we start having in Spanish art this portrait of the Moor as a noble and, you know, a great warrior, because it sort of conferred more. It's a bit the idea that we made of Saladin, right? A champion of chivalry. So it's not like there isn't some sort of also objectivity in certain levels of, for example, aristocratic or dynastic, international recognition, whatever. But it seems more like, in that sense, Spain was sort of claiming superiority for having defeated such a greater enemy than how they would have actually considered him in earlier times. The final question of this section is, was there any notable precedent that led to this policy being carried out? So you mean other kind of enforced conversion? Yeah, sure, but exactly on the basis of what I last said, this happened mostly in places that we do not have actually a great deal of information. This happened to an extent, because some of this was also voluntary conversion, by the way. It was more, we always see this as some sort of obscurantistic thing and evil or whatever. Many people fled, for example. Others just converted. I mean, it's much more variegated. We're talking a very large population of Muslims and Jews, the Mudayyars in the Iberian Peninsula. So a very large minority, even up to 40%, even places fairly northeast even. So you understand that to a degree this followed also a broader wave of political pragmatism, as you said, you pointed out, not just from the side of the governments, but because, by the way, Spain wasn't actually a unified monarchy until the 18th century, regardless of the dynastic cumulation of titles. And so it's very complicated even at that level to sort of specify and so on. Now, let's get actually to the spiciest stuff that really escalates brutally. I can't spoiler you immediately. Germany, a religious Ouroboros. Well, okay, doesn't explain the title, doesn't explain it all, but then we have United States, Black America, Russia, Sovietism, and Orthodoxy. So we really have, I appreciate surely the purposely escalatory nature of this content. I start suspecting there was some psychological manipulation behind this. So, no, but it's all really welcome. Germany, a religious Ouroboros. So the question says, a pagan people are enlightened to Christ, but receive him under the Aryan faith. So I would, as I said before, first of all, we'll define this a little bit better. It's not like the Germans were simply evangelized as Aryans, all right? Most of them probably were evangelized by the time the Franks conquered them. And so there was, for most Germans, no sort of Aryan in between. If we're talking about mostly the peoples who toured around, the globetrotters like the Goths, the Vandals, and so on, that, yes, mostly because of the relations with the empire. But even when we know, of course, for example, Clovis's mother was a Thuringian and she was Aryan, right? And basically pagan. That was for what we call pagan here in the question. As you know, is a concept that I thoroughly oppose, because paganism would have been considered an insult to these people, not much because they were called like that by the Christians, but because the concept of paganism is opposed to the ecumenic worldview that these peoples had in their relation with power. I mean, to them, pagans were really the lesser people of the villages, right, that believed mostly in chthonic superstitions and not in heavenly Odinism, something like that. So let's be a bit, I mean, this is beyond the question, naturally, because it's such a conventional terminology that one can't really ask too much of it. But this notion that, again, the first sort of Germany also, because here it says a pagan people, Germany, go on talking essentially about modern Germany. It's not really how it worked, all right? It's not like the Saxons were Aryan. Sure, there would have been Aryans among them at some point, but by the time they were also Roman Catholic Christians, essentially. But never mind. The question goes on and says, they then metamorphosize into an embodiment of Latin Christendom, which was actually their most consistent identity, just like the one of most of Europe and the most advanced part of Europe. So that's actually the most important part of the story. Only to spearhead the Protestant Reformation, which, however, I would point out, was not just half of Germany, but the poorer, less developed and less populated part of Germany. Specific, like, Bavaria. So, like, mostly, yes, it was all very irregular in the spread, but at large, civilization remains Catholic for a reason. So the question goes on, it says, as a period of secularization continued under the Weimar Republic, a gradual rise of atheism was taking place among the grassroots. A revival of paganism, here is capital letter, with its roots in the Volkisch movement, then manifested under Nazism. Nazism, which yearned for a revival of their ancestral pagan faith. Yes, but we should also understand actually which. Maybe this is not like the scope of the question, but let's go on. It says, it appears Jormungandr, having its appetite unquenched, bites its head. Right. So basically, the point of the question here is to claim that, I don't know for which reason, we'll try to investigate now, that basically Germany would continuously regenerate itself into something that will also come back to the point of the starting point, essentially some sort of pagan root, right? So I would be extremely careful about this for this to say this for the reasons we'll explain now. Let's first finish because really it's different levels and times, eras, right? You can't argue that paganism, as it's understood today, has anything to do with what the Germans actually believed before Christianity. And really at the deeper and most truly spiritual, traditional level that matters here. I've never really made videos overtly attacking neo-paganism and also the concept of paganism per se, but it has virtually nothing to do with what these people think it does. And it's often just very instrumentally used to make leverage on certain parts of the population that are, unironically, the ones that have, in fact, the least to do. They're most diametrically opposed with the concept of tradition as we know it. And we know it from the sources, from this actual, the Norse Germanic mythology more. That is much, in fact, more, this passes thugs, extremists, whatever, those guys back in the day would have destroyed you completely if you had just tried to compare yourself with them. They were much more truly, because there is a movement that basically says, oh no, that's not how those ancients were. They were actually just like more free-loving people, like some sort of hippies or like anti-right wing. But no, they were beyond the right wing, which is something most people do not really understand. It's like people will think that if you oppose nationalism, you're a left-winger. Like, they don't understand that nationalism is an anti-traditional ideology. It has nothing to do with the traditional concept of the nation and how this should win properly the heavenly right to lord over the rest of the world. They have zero idea of how that is attainable. It's just lesser people from fourth estate, post-traditional realities thinking that this is going anywhere with them just by, making leverage on their animal-like level of human and not manly development. If you know the difference between man and human, by the way, if you know the languages that you speak. In any case, the question goes on and says, you see the roots manifest into the modern day with the bizarre split between rainbow heathenism and neo-Nazism. And it's exactly what I was saying, like the notion that you find all these guys with, runes, tattoos, etc., that say, Nazis should stop appropriating ourselves with this symbol. As if, these people even had an actual idea of the fact that the reason that they are following, in many ways, the same post-traditional idea of ancient identity that the Nazis had. These are people who confuse 19th century ethno-national identities with the declination of universal tradition, for which today, by approximation convention, we claim, I don't know, there was some kind of a North Germanic mythology separated, say, from a Celtic one, from a Slavic one, as if that wasn't already in and of itself a product of the fall, and not even something to be particularly proud of in that sort of separation, with all, by the way, the chthonic elements that pullulate, especially, by the way, in fact, in the northern world, compared to other parts of the continent. But let's be real. There isn't such a thing like a resurgence. There is, if anything, a further depletion of that. You can even argue that neo-Nazism, to a broader essence, is more traditional than, of course, rainbow hedonism or some sort of idea of neutral hedonism, which is completely adulterated even from specific, enactment, for example, of power and transcendence in that sort of militant sense, which actually is very much tied with the original tradition, but that the Nazis, not even the neo-Nazis, failed to implement, as they, World War II also really showed, also because they were really a Christian nation to begin with, and it does not to say that there isn't a Catholic and that is universal traditional meaning in that Christian element. In fact, great part of what Germany really was, even in terms of power, whatever, is due to its Christianity. And so I wouldn't actually, here, by the way, there is a progression, says, from Protestantism to atheism to paganism. I mean, you could find a logic behind that, but I reject the premise that we're, first of all, talking about an Ouroboros that comes back to the starting point. And perhaps later I will also explain why. The question says, and with all this in mind, I would like to ask you, what does Schwerpunkt think about the Kulturkampf, given that the Germans had created a strong national identity with the dissociation of Catholicism? I reject properly the premise. I mean, most Christian Germans, at least today, are Catholic. You can make the case that, of course, I don't know, at the beginning of the 20th century, I think Protestants outnumber Catholics in the broader Germany of the time. Naturally, it was different from today, also, if anything, from a geographical point of view, from 2 to 1. However, not just still at the time, in fact, the Protestant world was poorer, but a great part of this stemmed from now essentially a Prussian world. In fact, here the thing will come here, because the question continues as, how did the southern German states react to the Kulturkampf during the nascency of German national identity? How did this change when German national identity matured? How did the religious landscape change after Prussia relinquished its cultural hegemony during the Weimar Republic, which is, well, considering how few that lasted, as compared also to Nazism in a more eclatant sense. I mean, it's not like Protestantism was eclipsed, at least, or the Prussian nature of Germany was eclipsed. As a matter of fact, still, I don't know, one of Hitler's titles just by German constitution was King of Prussia, as a matter of fact. So, are there any notable events you can point to in order to see the resurrection of neo-paganism prior to and during Nazi Germany? So let's be honest, like in general, like this is not something, a cycle as we see like this, that we can simply bring back as an Ouroboros to paganism, as a return of paganism, or what people think paganism is, right? This is a lot of questions, by the way, to unpack all together, and they're relatively vague, right? How did this, how did the relation essentially between the Protestants and the Catholics occurred throughout? I mean, if you know Bismarck's policy, the whole point was also opening to the Catholics because of essentially the necessity of a welfare state in the age of industrialization to counter the socialists that otherwise would have overrun like sort of the Wilhelmine, sort of probably Prussian idea of how Germany had to turn. Like, I don't see, say, World War One, of course, shatters a lot across the world, and Germany surely also in the following decade, in fact, was invested by a degree, as you know, of what is often conventionally described as a great moment of great cultural, artistic development, the avant-garde, and so on. But well, it was also playing debauchery to a degree, and part, in fact, of Nazi reaction stemmed from that, also from lots of foreign modes and this idea, of course, that Germany had been sort of backstabbed, and regardless of how this was properly developed as a concept, definitely there was a sense that Germany had to reappropriate itself of a past of grandeur, which, if anything, they had been able to accomplish since the unification, in this sense, as a very young state, or at least some states, but as you know, unified in a single political sense, as an empire, as a matter of fact. And there's too much, looking back at German history, people act as if, but the Germans were basically just, in the previous centuries, like, they didn't have all that. It's just a nationalistic myth that also later the Nazis invented, made up everything. I mean, these guys had literally held the whole Roman Empire. Germany was up to, the previous century, that as well, and also rising in the last, with Habsburgic Hohenzollern power to some very important levels of international relevance. One cannot really claim the Sonderweg was mere, German passive aggressiveness to explain why they hadn't been unified before, and or why they had objectively also remained a feudal country up to the 18th century or even the 19th in many areas. I don't believe that was a negative per se. So I don't believe in that sense that many people had really much of a vested nostalgia for what we conventionally call paganism. What happened with Nazism, Nazi fascism, and the cultivation of particular esoteric, mystical approach to the older religions, the idea, in particular for the Germans, in anti-Semitic direction, that Christianity was essentially it's a substack of Judaism. It has brought the sort of the worst aspects into German culture and had to be eliminated. First of all, it crashed its head against the fact that Germany was an overwhelmingly Christian country. It is true that the Nazi movement per se wasn't particularly espousing Christian feelings, but there were even Christian Nazi minority groups, whatever, that tended also toward that direction. In any case, 20th century Germany is a Christian country. There isn't much to do about that. And in many ways, also pretty traditional Christian country, right? So nothing, that from the Middle Ages could be claimed to be some, that was still paganism, burning under the embers or whatever. It's absolutely not. It's a good millennium, if not more, in specific areas of Christian absorption, stratification. That there isn't, the medieval German culture is a Christian culture, and the mistake that we tend to make is presuming that also within Christianity, and especially Catholicism, actually Catholicism is more important than Christianity. And many people do not know this, but it's actually something that, the Catholic Church still properly teaches priests about, that tradition predates Christianity. There is something Catholic, inherently Catholic in this faith that, in fact, is the Christianity just grafts itself on, right? And it's not specifically talking just about the Old Testament. It's talking about properly the broader universal meaning of that. It is extremely traditional. It's the single most traditional thing that exists in the world still today. Later, there is stuff now, again, about Islam that worries me in the question because, there is some sort of sympathy towards that. But we'll see how, theologically speaking, Islam has very heavy traditional inconsistencies or properly theological. Some aspects are more straightforward. There's no doubt, but others in fundamental. Think about the Trinity, the lack of the Trinity. If I start digressing on this now, I will make a 6 hours long video, and there is way sort of better way to organize my content, given that Q&As turn out to be rambles, but also for a good reason, because there is really a lot of stuff thrown in, especially with this kind of questions in the meat grinder, so to say. So to answer, for example, the first question, there is no doubt, I don't know, that Bavaria in particular, there was a hope of independence. That's also something existing in the Austrian tradition that had sort of swings, because at some point Austria received National Socialism, or at least welcomed National Socialism to a degree, regardless of the blood that was spilled. But still today we have, in fact, two different German states, so more actually, depending on what you're looking at specifically. The Nazi mysticism and the attraction towards a traditional ideal was mostly something developing in specific academic circles, some intellectual circles at the time for quite a while, like also the later 19th century. Everybody knew of the existence of this tradition. It was not really much of a mystery. Just the average person was Christian, say, and rediscovering that past was something mostly intellectual in nature. There isn't something like a neo-paganistic vibe in Nazi Germany other than probably the higher spheres, right? Probably the rest of the people would not be willing to accept it. It was just not something possible in a society of the first half of the 20th century, all right? So I definitely do not see also today's neo-pagan movements as any kind of return of the older beliefs of the pre-Christian past. Right? It's something extremely different, extremely fringe, extremely, by the way, ahistorical to a degree. Anti-historical to the degree you don't really want to hear what ancient spirituality was actually about, how this neo-paganism is completely modulated to this specific day and age, petty reasons of political, personal, emotional terms. It has nothing of the transcendence of the spirit. This is simply not possible to achieve in these times, at least at large, given the preconditions. It's not like, you have to free yourself of, either of Christian beliefs or whatever, and you will return to this. This is a Gnostic heresy. Essentially, it was hated by the very people you're presuming to honor through this nonsense that they would have heavily despised you for, and even just the way you promote, the way you live. Right, your ancestors would have been disgusted to see how you live in the early 21st century, and there isn't anything minimally moving toward that direction. It's just a further stage of human degeneration and subcultural and social malaise, disease, and it really only insults the memory of pre-Christian tradition. I don't think I have to answer this because it's here the question revolves about this 20 and part hint at a hint of 21st German feeling. I don't understand why it's also limited to Germany per se. Maybe just because it's the big country in Europe, and obviously this seems to have, with the broader imperial tradition, etc., some more relevance in nationalistic terms in a post-Nazi reality. But it's really, I can't really see the Ouroboros here, right? It seems just like a pretty dead, headless snake that does not even provide with the function of, alter ego counter of heavenly power to achieve anything here. It's just like such a disgusting reality we are living in moral, spiritual, cultural, in national point of view, that it has absolutely nothing to do left with what was quote unquote paganism. That of course your ancestors would have been tremendously disappointed by just hearing it as a word applied to them in conventional terms. All right. There is heathenism, but they still call themselves neo-pagan. And there is such a variety, by the way, of these movements that it's not even fair to properly claim that there is any consistency to the wall movement, nor that this as a wall is supposed to go anywhere. It's something significant or going where we know. And actually, there are some parallelisms here that are pretty much analogous, that, if anything, serve as a litmus test to see how, for example, this happens in Europe as opposed to what happens in the United States, and how we are actually drifting away from any higher principle to begin with in this fragmentation. In fact, the question continues with the United States. The question says, the United States often defines itself as a country with a populist origin, which divorces itself from the thrones of Europe. I may be uninformed, but I do not know any specific populistic reference to that. Of course, like there is a centrality of the people, etc. So maybe populistic is the sort of the emphasis on it. I don't know. It seems to me that there is rather some sort of today's populistic interpretation of that. There is, of course, some contrast. In fact, the question nails with, of course, the monarchies of the old continent, but I don't think it's merely populism, at least as we more conventionally intend that. The question says its religious identity is filled with controversy due to an allowance of religious freedom implying a secular state. Yet, Protestant Christianity was and is undeniably potent force in the US. From a superficial perspective, one would think that the US is an antithesis to the old order of Europe, of tradition, etc. Growing up in the United States, it was common for many Protestants to view Catholics as being cult-like and labeled as not true Christians. Some preachers even claimed that a future pope will be the Antichrist. So I wonder, given the amount of criticism your channel has levied towards Protestants, how does Schwerpunkt conceptualize the US as the current global power given its anti-Catholic past and present? Here's a good question. Given the iconoclastic nature of Protestant Americans, what does it mean for the US to be able to thrive and lead the current world in culture and politics? Do you see it? I read it all because it makes more sense than to answer certain things. Do you see it collapsing anytime soon? Why does Schwerpunkt glorify the US despite many Americans having a condescending view of the European legacy? Having listened to so many of your lectures, I understand that the US is not so much of an antithesis of tradition based on your views. For example, you note that religion and state had always been separate in the West, or that the Enlightenment was not a rebellion against tradition, but was a restoration of it. Well, let's say better, it was an attempted restoration made it worse. All right. This partly contains the answer. It says, yet despite these statements, I'm still curious as to how you understand my country. So the question is very complex, because indeed the main point of Schwerpunkt is that power can be achieved only by doing things right? So if America is so powerful, it has done things right. So first of all, in a broader picture, it's not like the United States in historical perspective is, such an omnipresent ecumenic force. Like it's a new country, so to say. It's still a young power, to say the least, that sort of historically maturing in ways that other countries haven't done. And there is an explanation that you can give to the idea that breaking from Catholicism essentially releases some forces that otherwise would have been devoted to a more collective effort, and therefore devoted to some sort of more central power, right? In many ways, I see the outcome of the Reformation, at least for those countries that specifically, in fact, had something more, because it's not like, Scotland or Hungary in their Calvinism went very far, in the history of mankind. But let's say definitely the Anglo-Saxon tradition is very much the carrier of some important sensitivity to, in fact, a spiritual, a religious identity, as it's called here by the question, and that is, in fact, subtler and somehow mitigated to some degree. The United States, yes, like if you're thinking about the WASPs as a whole, yes, the Protestantism has heavily, even probably a Puritanic mentality has informed in all the other groups. Right? Not even a religious level. Like if you speak with an American Catholic, he sounds very much more like a Protestant or a Puritan, even within it, than how you would normally understand a European Catholic. This is really normal. If you travel across Europe, I don't know, an Italian or a Pole, Catholics are still very different in views, and this is completely normal. So This, first of all, tells you how there are some factors that play behind the sort of the formal religious background of a people that is still obviously complex. I believe in particular what the United States inherited from the Anglo-Saxon tradition as the most foundational of all in that regard, and that wasn't in fact merely Protestant, as you know, as also the Anglican Church is retaining lots of sort of Catholic elements and so on, was in particular aware of the value of the people. There is something we could extend to other populations, even what happened in Germany, right? Not necessarily being more advanced means to be the more morally intact. Like there is a sense that civilizations at some point exhaust themselves, burn out, like they manage to achieve this great moral power, and then they're still, however, humans because they haven't, they're still mortal. They haven't achieved a fully divine power. They haven't been able to literally take over everything, and therefore they eventually fade and sometimes lose properly even their backbone, their spirit had characterized them. When you look at a people like the English, you can appreciate how much of a crossroad that is. It's essentially Western Europe, post-Roman, but also Northern European, and informed with the sense of almost, I can't say rebel mentality, but one that still, as you said here, for example, use the term populistic, but well, that is kind of something perhaps better interpreted as rebellistic, even if you have to use an ism. But there is a notion that you can't trample somebody else's rights, that at least your own rights are to be defended in arms, that the government can absolutely abuse of its power and transform into a tyranny, etc. So there are sort of pros and cons to all of this. There is, in particular with the United States, the main problem is not much an ignorance of traditional legacy, but its self-referentiality, right? From one side, you have the sense of manifest destiny, which is a providential idea of empire at the end of the day. And from the other, you have this, in that fringe, like the populistic sort of lesser person that says, I'm fine just the way I am. It's basically an excuse to just remain just a human, just a forestator. In fact, the way to tradition, also in a sort of broader spiritual sense, well, in the doctrine of the cases, etc., is not much, in fact, measured through a flat, homogeneous identity, a national one, a religious one, but essentially what you contribute with to it, from which standpoint, which quantity and quality. So I will not try to sort of enter sociological and politicological criticism and analysis of the United States. But let's say there are some currents that within the foundational element of American culture that provided this country with an enormous sense of what, in fact, Americans call freedom, like this, that they often literally don't know what it even means. Freedom belongs only to God, right? So there is, even though, again, the populist element pretends to be free, what they actually mean is that they want to be left alone, as if doing nothing or not doing what the broader group is up to for whichever reason that you could also come to invert if you really can't take over and demonstrate your power. And that is, in and of itself, in fact, the manifestation of a higher power, not much of a tyranny, as long as, in fact, the people is able to rise and with sort of freedom antibodies, so to say, that allow, in fact, still for and in fact, the U.S. institutional system, checks and balances, the entire architecture, I think, of the states is incredibly well calibrated for, differently from other countries. This is extraordinary also because the United States as such is a pretty enormous country, right? And in this sense, it showed the world the incredible capacity to actually be able to stick together, even through massacres of biblical proportions during the Civil War, through definitely also all the decadence from the sort of primigenial ideals, and especially nowadays, given that the question poses, like, do you think that the United States will collapse anytime soon? Well, this is not really something you should ask. One could really answer even. I don't necessarily think the United States will collapse. Like, there is this American obsession towards civil war and this infighting, but it's basically self-referentiality. Like, if Americans are not ignorant, really, they're not an ignorant people, as many Europeans claim on a regular basis. But there is something possibly even worse. We all have our bad things, like in Europe as well. But the American one seems to be self-referentiality. Like, if especially this power lays in the people, which, most, especially populistic movements, also the majority of people actually claim it is not the case. I think if they were able to see themselves from the external and seeing how the rest of the world actually works, including Europe and etc., and not much because of the notion that, I don't know, Europe would be some sort of socialists with a tyrannical European Union, whatever. If anything, it's the opposite. It's something that we haven't been able to achieve as a bigger power, something that controls more and is able to do so exactly because of the energetic and determined participation of the people. Let's leave the sort of the socialist aspect aside. It's just what the Americans think regarding, at least in a very specific way, they address the welfare issue. So I'm not even claiming that there should be more or less. As you know, I'm not really particularly inclined towards the left. However, I think that these qualities are actually more important, especially in an age in which really what does it mean to be a Protestant, to be a Catholic, right? Are people today even sticking to the standards of just, 100, 200 years ago, right? The change is so big that at this point it's not even about being formally Catholic or Protestant. At this point, it's mostly, still questioning what the hell you are to begin with, right? So much what you see in the United States is some form of religious identitarianism. You were talking before about white nationalism in your experiences also as a non-white American. That's a part of it. That's a component that, however, lacks probably a heavenly lead, right? And it's sort of the lower aspect of something that used to work and definitely brought the United States where it is today. Except today, you don't have much of a at least of the leadership that also, of course, informed by the people that used the United States in their best era used to probably present in a very spiritual sense. I think this is true also for the English people. There is something deeply traditional, even aesthetically speaking, in their way to identity, to national, also religious identity. In that sense, I think that discipline, constraint is what really matters more than at that point confession, because of the sad realization that most people upholding those standards are not enough to uphold confessional ones, meaning that most people do not even know what's the difference between Protestantism and Catholicism. Of course, they are heavily different, and as I said before, Catholicism is the actual way, it's the actual most traditional way, and not just out of how people even understand traditional, meaning, it's something that people used to do in the past. We have arrived literally to this point, right, where being a Protestant is just a matter of, you were born in a Protestant family, like, it's completely understandable, right? But it's still not even starting to look at the beyond, at the past, and why you came to be that to begin with. It's mere fortestate. In fact, populism, identitarianism, it has nothing to do anymore with some capacity of seeing oneself properly as a world leader. Many things work in the United States still, because in any case, if you have been a world leader, you still know how to do that, right? And you still are unsurpassed, right? So something in the United States evidently works still, and it works even well. I will not digress in contemporary politics, because I said, the United States lack leadership. I personally have a more positive than not opinion about Trump, for example. But again, you have to report this to the Times. Not much, because I think that, I like Trump, or I would like him to be there. But let's say you all, especially as a historian, you have in a conflictual scenario, you have to ask yourself, is there actually any better or at least is the system capable of providing anything better? And of course, if you look at the situation of the country, well, obviously not. All right, it's like those people that Americans feel very much this fact of being divided. All right, it's maybe a Civil War legacy, and more is this idea that the system does not work because there is the guy from the other side that is always creating sort of a parallel country within the country. But the sad, bitter realization is that, say, if the left sucks to the way it does, in any case, it's also because the right sucks. Right? You may be better or worse. There is no doubt about that. It's just what I just said here, that basically confession does not matter anymore. Why? Because here, not even religion matters anymore, by this human standard. So, in that sense, the hypocrisy, and that's also a very puritanic thing of presuming that you are the elect, that you are the better one, just for no reason, no accomplishment whatsoever, just because, is totally ridiculous, and it turns out into some Gnostic paranoia, right? Conspiracy theory and so on, because you cannot afford to accept that the very reason why your country sucks is you, right? Because you as an Irish person are the perfect reflection of the low standards that exist. This is valid also for Europe, is valid for any country, provided that we are the best countries in the world as the West, but that definitely are facing a deep identity crisis that should, perhaps in this question, was useful because it highlights the necessity to realize that we're part of a whole, right? That we all come, especially if you look at the West, like there is here the question says, why does Schwerpunkt glorify the US despite many Americans having a condescending view of the European legacy? Because many Americans do not count anything in the world. Right, only specific Americans count in the world. They have power, they have moral capacity, and they're the ones who have greater view and power. And those are not really condescending of Europeans. There are so many Americans that come to Europe, make videos of, oh, I live in Europe. This is so beautiful. Look, I have free healthcare, and here I go to the bicycle to the work, and I keep. Yeah, well, okay, we are at this level of dementia. I can't really think, and why that's, for example, from a European perspective, a completely American product and one of the worst possible ones. It's not like you have to glorify or to demonize Europe or America in this sense. It's really about realizing that you acting as a monad in an atomistic context in which you think that, and you're so spoiled that you think that the world should fit some sort of strange rules without understanding even where that comes from, and just basing yourself on an empirical impression. This is unfortunately empiricism, a very, it has pros and cons, but it's very characteristic of Anglo-American culture, is in this sense useless because it creates more division as opposed to create more union, right? And so the reason why the United States do so well is because they sprang out of Europe, they sprang out of the opportunity to dictate your own rule in your own land, because you were supported also by other powers. Without Europe, the United States would have not been born. Probably also during the War of Independence, the war was won at sea. It had really few to do with Minutemen and everything. I'm sorry to say that, because there is a beautiful saga and ideology, of course, of the American independence, where that spirit lives, and in that sense is not diminished by the outcome or how it was reached, because it was a chance that was given, it was a promise, it was a rebooting, was the possibility of seeing this world as something that hardly it had been recreatable, so to say, in historical times. Like, which country could simply set itself free? It's a biblical history almost. In with this enormous potential for expansion, this solid background, right? North America, the New England in general was like Europe in many ways. Like, it was part of Europe, just it was across the Atlantic, but the people, the landscape, everything was very much in line with it all. And the enormous resources laying west and the opportunity that came internationally with it, is something that could not but seem auspicious and confer an enormously redeeming attitude to the American people. There's an innate sense of responsibility, of self-reliance. These are all incredibly important traditional characteristics. And in this sense, the United States was unapologetically leading the way. Also, as far as, it was capable of bombing and conquering. That's also a very, very positive thing. Actually, I would say the United States were particularly moderate as the major world power historically for that, compared to what, Marxists, I don't know why I use this punchline, but, it's the criticism about the United States being everywhere, being bad because they fought abroad and all this BS, right? Say it's actually a mark of greatness. And I think that one effect of the defects of the United States stemming from the populistic background, the humus underground, is isolationism. There is hardly any indicator of the deeply seated inferiority of a people like isolationism. And this belongs again to populism. It doesn't seem that the United States turned out to be particularly isolationistic at this point in history. There are all ways you can comment on what happened in the last years, whatever, but definitely what many Americans complain about, namely the idea that there's some sort of deep state or something that goes against their own will. Well, this is basic reality. Like if you're not strong enough to influence the political process, it's because you're weak. It's not because there is a conspiracy against you. It's because you're not enough as a person, right? It's not like there is a Kabbalah of people out there that controls the whole world. If it were so, we would live, first of all, in a very different world. And secondly, just the fact that allegedly they do have to mitigate themselves. By the way, with people like in these countries in particular, living with the greatest wealth in the world, having the greatest power in the world as a country, as a nation, well, it's not really, this hallmark of tyranny or self-destruction. If anything, we're seeing an increasing delusional support. We've seen this basically if you follow, I don't know, Tucker Carlson and Nick Fuentes or etc. Like they're essentially making Hamas propaganda. I mean, if you say that, we could easily digress on the politological meaning of what it means to take a side, right? But if you're actively saying that, I don't know, Israel is the utmost evil, and the United States pay for nothing or just to give power to this terrible Jews or whatever, and that's the cause of all problems and whatever, you're actively backing Islamists and Marxists that are, by the way, within our world, because in the real world of Islamism, Marxists would be all dead for that matter, actively self-destroying the country. And not succeeding, because again, lesser people are always going to be lesser people, and the French is always going to be the French. These are in fact, subhumus kind of, degenerations that you find even in, I don't know, in this aforementioned neo-paganism. This is just a feministic fantasy, an alienation from reality, hoping that going crazy makes you more powerful. Going crazy makes you weaker. And you will be crushed, as you've always been crushed throughout history. And the only thing you say when you're self-destroying yourself is that it was all the fault of essentially the people that you are trying to destroy, because you're actually backing the same people that are killing you, all right? And this fortunately doesn't quite happen. I think that it's very good for the West to dominate over other peoples. I believe it's very good for the West to dictate which country decides to have self-determination or not, because I think that we're inherently superior. Our culture shows that. We are up to it. Our power is manifest. And in this sense, any problem that occurs in the world is our fault to the extent we're not strong enough, we're not going too hard on countries that, in fact, can't just creep from the outskirts and not really having anything else better to do than whining about the fact that they feel to be inferior. Always remember that there's an enormous sense of shame among the underdeveloped, right? There is probably the absolute realization that they suck, and they deeply envy the better. And a healthy person just recognizes that there are better and worse people, like, unless there's only one person in the world. All the others are worse than, and all the others, so we're accommodated, maybe, I don't know, Schwerpunkt is the best person in the world, but we are accommodated by some degree of humility, at least we should be, that makes us realize that, in fact, there's always somebody better that knows better, that is a better person, does better things, and that therefore deserves to be in charge, as opposed to those who are incompetent, who can't, right? And I think in this sense, the United States was, in its sort of head-on attitude towards history, the world, etc., like an absolute force of, to a degree of divine manifestation. Also, regardless of the fact that they were Protestants and they had a very sort of rigged moral approach to many aspects. Like, I'm actually heavily critical of American society. I do think that there is something deeply disturbing about all what is happening there. I follow American political commentaries all the time, and I absolutely realize that it's a country that seems to be exhausting itself of that aforementioned power. In fact, I absolutely and distinctly see the decline. Right? It's not to say this is like powers in history. Like, you can't avoid to claim, okay, this power did actually good at some point, and then it fell. Yes, but it sort of did that, and usually also maintained some of that grandeur. It's like Britain nowadays. You can argue this, but when will Britain collapse? I mean, we can't pose the same question. But it's not like all of a sudden what defined Britain is gone, right? And it's going simply to go. Or it can easily happen, but it's not by obliterating this country from the face of the earth because you hate it in a personal sense, or I don't know, you're anti-American, you're anti-Anglo-Saxon, whatever, because you think, I don't know, that this is where the world, where the degeneracy began, or whatever, that is going to help you, right? Because with the greatness that the Anglo-American world displayed historically, you could actually obtain so much more, and it's better to salvage this than pretending that there's only bad in it, even in front of the worst aspect of the same. Right, the rest of the world is not better at all, and that's the reason why I actually like the United States. Right, I don't think in the sense that even the Protestant label is absolutely defining. On the contrary, there are many Catholics historically. The Irish, the Italians, many Germans as well, who we were talking about before, and also the Spaniards and so on. So there is something which really matters in the capacity, in fact, of holding this system together with the elements that successfully worked together, as opposed to elements that are incompatible with the system or at least are detrimental to it and are sort of rotting the system as well. So this is the substack of United States question, Black America. So it says, it is without a doubt that Christianity has remained controversial in its role with the transatlantic slave trade. Well, I don't think it's much of a problem with Christianity. I mean, slave trade was present everywhere. It's not like Christianity or non-Christianity changed really much. On the contrary, Christianity is what sort of in the West largely proposed, like eventually like the abolition of slavery and much more sort of liberal regulation. It could be seen to an extent even as a sort of fall from some traditional standards, but it really depends, as we were saying before, how you understand control, power. Like if there is a transfigurationally redeeming mechanism where you can find like some thing to achieve, like think about the manumission in the Roman world, the extension of the citizenship. This was earned, right? You can argue that, of course, like what happened, for example, in the United States with slavery happened, in pretty post-traditional times to an extent. But as we know, the Civil War in itself was understood partially as some evangelical matter, all right? From both sides, by the way, because it's not like slavery was merely this may sound terrible from a conventional American perspective, but it's not like slavery was literally the index of absolute civilizational incompatibility. There were many other places in the world that had slavery and that also had a power and influence and whatever. If anything, time had come, considering the American development, for this thing to appear really as obsolete. And it's not like the Civil War was a great spectacle at the end of the day, and the North was easily more racist even than the South. It was at least debatable. But there's also no doubt that the South was the losing side for its obsolescence. And this also largely entails slavery and its sort of production mechanism, etc., in a much more complicated frame than, in fact, like, slavery per se or whatever. It's all baked into that. You can't objectively sort of say, no, it wasn't actually about slavery. It was really about slavery. The war was actually fought over slavery rather than because of slavery per se. But it's in fact a much bigger deal, where you understand that slavery was just part of the things that were eventually, changed, in that case abolished, gradually, by the way, by the war, in a set of many other aspects, many other sort of forces that were working. Now in the United States, it could not really afford to be divided, and there are, for example, when I made some videos about the Civil War, there are some interesting comments regarding the fact that, of course, the system, that there was also a big Civil War that sort of could have broken out also decades later, that the system obviously was imperfect, that sort of the abolition of slavery was in many ways done in ways that even partially reward, or at least let some aspects unsolved for the same Southern establishment to still keep profiting out of the mess that had followed and all this stuff. They were, in a sense, that the narrative up to recently, historically, is that the Southerners were, after all, the chivalrous, knightly, sort of old-fashioned aristocrats that, after all, had sold their skin pretty dearly, and so they had to be admired. There was really some of that as well. And the issue of slavery in its sort of most dramatic and terrible aspect was, in that sense, overshadowed to the detriment, in fact, of the possibility of a more unitarily effective narrative, which is not, in fact, the one of simply, the South was bad because they had slaves, and so everybody else was better than that. That's just not really the historical narrative of it, right? It's the narrative of why did the South lose to begin with, right? Again, it's all baked in. You can't sort of make distinctions. It was also because of slavery, but it was not to the sort of grievous aspect of what, if you think about it, derives from knowing still today in 2025 that your ancestors were slaves at some point. I mean, this is valid for most people, actually, arguably for all people in the world, but of course for something that was still a thing a few generations ago in some families in Black America. Well, that's something scarring from a moral point of view. It's something really heavy, and so it's something that should be discussed and debated. It's actually been done. The notion that there is no clue about what actually of racism, of slavery, it's complete BS. We studied also in Europe. It's all very sort of basically and neutrally told. So America does not have some inherent issue with racism per se. At least not more than the rest of the world is, but then you want to draw the line. Actually, America is probably one of the least racist countries in Europe. Maybe it's racialistically biased in a peculiarly political sense, because of what, in fact, America had to represent as a stainless, sort of heroic figure, and realizing it was essentially a colonial country with slavery up to very recent past that didn't sort of align with some other narratives. But I can think, the entire colonial past to a degree carries that. And so I don't really see, of course, any exceptionalism within the United States, if not because they have a unique history, as any country really does. And the American one is very, very important, very, very big. But continuing with the question, in some ways, Christianity acted as a tool of liberation, in other ways, as a tool of enslavement. Again, you can make the case that this is Christianity. Christianity is actually not much in line with the idea. Christianity is also, rooted in scriptures that described a world where slavery was normal, but fundamentally criticized by the core assumption that, in fact, if you let the divine spark bloom in the heart of man through Christian transfiguration, you could really achieve incredible heights. So I wouldn't really say that just because there were Christian slave traders that it's Christianity per se that mattered that much. I don't really. I know that as from an American perspective, you probably feel as it is in the United States a huge deal, but it doesn't seem to me like it's a specifically Christian thing. And then before you said, okay, I know of Christian nationalism that is usually sort of flirting with pro slavery postures and beliefs. Nostalgia, romanticism, whatever you want to call it. But in that sense, it's more like, again, fringe provocation than necessarily something relevant to today's political debate, I think. The question goes on and says, many black Americans, specifically those descended from freed men, find themselves living in a conflict in their relationship with the church. When combining America's racist past along with the Eurocentric nature of American Christianity, some opted to embrace Islam. Okay, so no, I was disagreeing today when I read this stuff. No, I thoroughly reject this idea, because my understanding is that the most defining feature of Black America is its Christianity. All right, if there is a Black identity in America, it heavily overlaps, historically overlaps with a Christian background, in that sense, a conservative background, regardless of the fact that, especially from the 1960s, 1970s, things changed because of subsidies, because of a completely different sort of orientation towards and the racialization of politics that ruined also the Black households, right from that point onward. So, and households that had really struggled enormously to be successfully integrated into the fabric of society, from slavery to segregation, etc. So I don't think really that this is a right premise. I don't think I understand the point. I understand that the church and the churches actually of America, in many cases, somehow kept this. Since the beginning, if you go back to the foundation and before, kept slavery running. But again, at that point, it becomes more like a universal issue than a problem of the church per se. I mean, you say here, when combining America's racist past along with Eurocentric nature of American Christianity, some opted to embrace Islam, African paganism, or atheism. What do you think that, many of these blacks were actually sold by Muslims, Muslim blacks, right, for that matter. So it's this kind of attitude. I parallel it entirely to the neo-paganistic stuff before. I mean, if you're a Black American and you convert to Islam, of course we're talking Cassius Clay, Muhammad Ali, African paganism, what's Kangs, all that stuff, or even atheism. Well, atheism is at least a sort of, it's difficult to define because it can be also different things at the same time. But if you choose those aforementioned characteristic communities, this is no better than the neo-pagan. It's basically a fantasy alienation from reality without any cultural, historical background, and it's just a provocation, whining. It's a complaint. It's some sort of mark of unsatisfaction, of protest, whatever, because there is something at the end of the day wrong with you at that point if you decide to use, by the way, some of these ideas for different reasons, just for that kind of protest, whatever. You can understand it. Honestly, I've never met a neo-pagan, for example, that wasn't essentially indoctrinated by Christians. So I don't think that here, like, I personally don't come from a background where I can't see I'm in a way because I was informed something. Fortunately, My family transmitted me very sort of sound beliefs, but always allowed me to choose autonomously, which I think was extraordinary, and just the specific alchemy of my background, where I'm from, how it happened to me to come to study the things I do and to develop my ideas regarding religion, etc. So I consider myself extremely lucky and grateful for that matter. I realized that especially atheism starts from some sort of butthurt attitude that at the end of the day has always to do with somebody complaining about something that went wrong for them, and that they attribute the fault to somebody else rather than themselves, even as they were what we would consider today as conventional victims, which is what tradition says is not the case. And at that point, no wonder you will hate tradition, you will hate the church, because at that point, you don't even see what's the point of it. And the reason is easily bad Christianity, bad churches, and all what I said before regarding the fact that people don't even Protestant, Catholic, it's more like cultural and subcultural attitudes as much as this ones really are. It's just like, the LGBTQ stuff. They're just fashions. They have no connection with any deeper idea, if anything, because they fly low. Right? It's not like they're not archetypal ideas. Transgenderism is purely a agnostic heresy, right? It's ABC sort of manual Gnosticism. So these things always existed, by the way. It repeated themselves. They manifest differently throughout history, but and also in ever worse and most disgusting and emptying and unfortunate fashion. But anyhow. The question goes on, it says, it is unfortunate that African Christendom's past is often forgotten. That much I give you, and then it's, but I don't think it connects very much with Black America per se, right? Some of that could be, but who knows where you came from at that point. But surely, yes, Christian Africa has a very interesting history. Also made some videos about that, especially from a military point of view. Continuing the question, and overshadowed by the legacy of slavery and the more, quote-unquote, more inclusive Muslims. Yes, they were as bad as they got, right? Look at how, what the Ottoman Empire, Mughal India did with black slaves, for that matter. So the myth that Christianity has something uniquely to do with slavery, or that was allegedly something, but actually that doesn't seem to be at all the case. Just reflecting the fact that America was and still is a colonial country. There isn't much to do about that. That's just how the world worked, right? And if anything, these are the very places from which actually, in true Christian lens, slavery was gradually abolished. The identity crisis, I'm reading the question, the identity crisis of these people has also manifested the bizarre religious movements, such as the Hebrew Israelites, yes, and the Nation of Islam, both of which are more so black power movements than they are religious organizations. Absolutely. Many of, and you understand also how self-referential, in a sense, it all is, because they seem to start from a book, at least, or at least... I'm not extremely familiar with the Nation of Islam, but say the idea that, the Jews were blacks and everything, that's sort of immediately as understandably rising from a specifically, even I would say a very specific streak of American attitude to the Bible. There is no way around that. And that, of course, the sense that that there is all this slavery issue again, and the freeing of the oppressed black, and so just much as the Jews with the Egyptians and so on. In any case, going on with the question, many often mock these strange faiths, but it is apparent that the creation of these beliefs are a human phenomena seen throughout all cultures. While there are plenty of historical examples to draw from, the modern existence of Anglo-Israelism proves my point. Everyone will exhibit a certain degree of bias, seeing themselves in history where they were not. Black America follows this phenomenon, but has an enhanced vigor due to the evisceration of their pre-American roots and the heterogeneous nature of their African ancestors. I would add, as Schwerpunkt, that what we see today, especially with the revival of nativism, of this BS, is that just as much as the previous movement, it has absolutely nothing to do with what they're supposedly talking about. And so, in fact, when I look at, the Hebrew Israelite, the black sort of Jews movement, because so call it, I can't define it better, and so on, that's actually something mostly stemming from apparently a conservative standpoint, right? The aforementioned standard conservatism in Christianity of Black American culture back in, up to very few generations ago. Whereas what we're seeing with nativism is basically Marxism. It's basically Islamism. It's all one. I mean, it doesn't matter if you're claiming, to descend from the Aztecs. It's Islamism, point, right? It's all one. It's the cheap, no-brainer kind of way to trying to destroy civilization because you understand that you cannot afford to place into it, at least because you're a lesser person, not because you couldn't if you weren't a lesser person. So always blaming others for your own shortcomings. And so then the question continues, it says, the broader society often fails to understand this tragedy, though it is not helped by Black America's lack of effort and enthusiasm to educate themselves on such matters. Like I would say most Americans to begin with, and of course, like the disastered, the socially disastered Black America. Now, given the cultural influence of the US, what does Schwerpunkt think about Afrocentric history and blackwashing? Honestly, I've never really gotten into that. The closest I've come to that was when I criticized that video by Metatron that in order to go against black, I don't even remember how. It had been sparring with black supremacists and blackwashers. And he had made so many videos in that sense because they were claiming, that the Romans were black, whatever. That at some point he made a video that had to counter that, like the Roman were Nordics and they weren't Nordics. And he made that video by essentially saying that, the Italians were some sort of half race of whatever, according to some sources that, had nothing to do actually with the very sort of racialist, say, phenotypically overcharged and nature of the fair ancestry of the Romano Italics from their own mythology, which is extremely interesting and sort of also very underappreciated to an extent. So I stayed carefully aware I don't know also how would it be interesting for me to talk about Afrocentric history and blackwashing. I'm just glad to have, people from all backgrounds to follow me. I see, I have Black Americans following, but some dedicated audience. It's very positive for me. I really like the fact that many people from any possible country in the world, I see it from the stats. Like it makes you, there are some states that you also forgot the names of across the world, some colonial ones for that matter. And it makes you really think, like, if we have a unified and shared sense of history, like, that's a win. That's a massive win for everybody involved. And I'm very glad that we can come together with this stuff because it seems like that's actually the cure for a lot of things going wrong. So the question says, how can learning Christian history mitigate both right-wing and left-wing extremism? This is an incredibly important question. It's a pity that we have such a short amount of time, at least for this video, because each of these questions would deserve so much. In part, I just explained how, right? I think that Christian history is the history of an incredibly variegated group, right? You can't see how Christianity is blamed in a sort of mono-stamp kind of idea of cultural, moral vibes, etc. Like Christianity had so many different declinations. I'm not talking about specifically sects or heresies or whatever, but in the sense like how Christianity was applied by different peoples. I, for example, think that Latin Germanic Christendom inherited an enormous amount of a truly sort of historically Indo-European Catholic traditional meaning of everything. And I think that it heavily informed also the Anglo-Saxon one in the process. And much, for example, of American power and merit is a direct emanation of the same. And also for reasons you can find, in fact, also in the Indo-European background, in the broader, also just European, one in the Western one. There are so many different ways of looking at this. And Christian history, if anything, is a matter of studying real church history. If you don't do that, I think it's very difficult for anyone to understand what Christianity is actually about. I may not exactly know anyone at this point in my life that knows what I actually have come to understand. I'm not claiming that I'm absolutely right or whatever, but say the obvious depth of religion in general, not just Christianity, but probably how we see religion, is immense. It's something that has barely to do with how people, again, stamp a label on one another. Maybe from American perspective, you acknowledge this, the fact that Americans are fixated with tags, with categories, with this guy is this and that, it belongs to that group, it has this characteristic, that you're just trained to be that, because you're just, I don't know, a country with so many different people. As you said yourself, you have your own specific ethnic background, your own, in that sense, feeling toward the same, that at the same time sort of merges with the American one to I'm sure, also a positive way, because I understand also from the questions that there is a deep concern for this, and that's always positive. So I don't think that the history of Christianity is even needed to be used merely for mitigating political extremism. In and of itself, as history, just shows you the staunch success, first of all, of the religion, but it shows you how sort of above parts, because it truly, as a traditional, as the relic of the truly traditional belief, is supposed to transcend that, right? And it's I can't find now a better way to historicistically explain this for the short time that we have left. But it's obvious that Christianity plays an overarching role that for millennia had just a very sort of obviously ecumenic nature, performing the same function without anyone having issues with that sense within the same Christianity, with being Christian, regardless of political extremism or whatever. There were clashes of that kind, and Christianity was in fact interpreted and misinterpreted in many ways, but I can't put on Christianity any blame for what nobody really can. I mean, it's really a bold claim in general, and I know it's very American, it's very discussed in the United States that Christianity comes with slavery. That's a very common American association, but you hear the stuff just basically in America, in the most Americanized European, mostly leftistic realities. It has barely any other place. Like, if anything, also the aforementioned sort of far right, associated, not associated with neo-paganism, mostly blames Christianity for other reasons, not because it's really, it had to do with slavery. As a matter of fact, they would reinstate slavery in their view. And so it really depends enormously on what kind of, those would accuse Christianity to have been meek, that it would have had to be much harsher with slaves and how it would be used. So I would say that it's exactly these misinterpretations also that reveal how much Christianity does not have much to do with this whole picture. And again, not to responsibilize Christians who did this. You can't simply say, well, but Christianity says something, Christians do something else. It's not an excuse for Christians, or even it's simply realizing that there are two different levels. They're not two different things, but they're two different levels of the same thing, right? And the justification of slavery is something that can easily be found just out of social cultural reasons. You don't have to take in particular a religion or another into question. Christianity is definitely not pushing, but I mean, if you read the Old Testament, obviously there is plenty of slaves' histories and so on, but because it was also written in a time in history where this was sort of more pronounced. When you look at Islam, for example, it in and of itself is much more inclined to affirm a sense of enslavement, even from a psychological point of view, which is actually what Islam really means. But the only reason why we're talking about this is that America is incredibly so-called progressive and has decided to blame Christianity for everything, whereas other religions may have been much worse in the last 2,000 years. And so again, I don't see the point, and I think it's somehow I'm not saying this necessarily to the author of the question, but to anyone who's making that claim to begin with. And finally, he asks for this Christian thing: how can the traditional understanding of ecumenism help promote social harmony? Here it says multiculturalism, I think it is misspelled, whilst cleansing it of post-modern poisons. Well, this is also a very deep question, because I realized on Schwerpunkt that I trigger a group of people who is accusing me, for example, of globalism, because I have simply a universal view. That is the traditional one. I mean, literally the traditional one is Catholic by definition, because it's true, the two natures. It's all encompassing. It means divine, right? It's not a matter of multiculturalism. It has nothing to do with that. That already belongs to a language that is post-traditional in nature. It's not like we have to force the coexistence of different groups with one another. Who cares about that? It sounds also like a pretty bad idea. I mean, having multiple cultures next to one another peacefully coexisting seems perfectly fine, except you should find an example of this. You can argue that every person is either better or worse. So, for example, you speak of your own background and the fact that you are also American, so it seems like a history of success again, and so a very positive attitude toward the world, and that's also a good reason why, for example, we can make such good questions. I can't see you as the product of immigration and therefore something bad. I'm obviously, my political leanings are very obvious in all this, but I value person by person. I oppose a specific political direction, and I obviously loathe multiculturalism, not just, mostly because of the ism, right? Every person can be considered a culture on their own if you really dig deeper, but let's say the point is, who's better, who's worse? I don't believe in equality, and therefore I don't believe in the idea that you can force people together by the only way to do that is flattening everything, which is communism. And tradition speaks of a hierarchy, of a corporative ideal where the better is above, the worse is under, and this happens automatically, immediately. Just by the virtue and the force of the individual. And this body has, however, a transcendental capacity. And there you can have multiple cultures. I mean, for example, Jews were always actually, while discriminated against, actually protected by Christian authorities. In the Middle Ages, the idea is that you can't touch the Jews because they have to be the witness of the end time. They're the closest that exists to Christians. And you have essentially to show them that they are wrong, because literally also the idea is that they are going to hell anyway because they're not Christians. And so that's as brutal as it sounds, but it serves a purpose, right? The idea of the Holocaust, for example, is anti-traditional to the degree that instead of transcending that people, making them transfigure, if you identify in them something that didn't work, you exterminated them. In that sense, you simply decided to incinerate life as opposed to augmenting it. And very cynically, one could even think of a trade-off. In tradition, there is a sense that, of course, for a sacrifice, you can have an augmentation, but the way, in fact, the Holocaust was carried out was squalidly post-traditional, other than genocidal and murders and all what came with that, including basically from a simple racial standpoint. There were plenty of Jews that were more Aryan than, phenotypically speaking, than the average German, as a matter of fact, and that those were because they were Jews by, in that sense, cultural ancestry and identity. They were put to death in the horrifying ways that we know. So honestly, I don't really see much of a point to that. I see the good of our civilization, how I described, for example, the United States before, the good of it. Let's not trash things because they start go wrong. Let's try to fix them, right? But the good that is in them. And so everything can work well if you really want it to do, because your power is technically infinite in potential, right? And so I think that this is the easy way to express an ecumenic view, or probably a universal one. So not much ecumenism per se, but literally the realization that we're all on the same boat to a degree. In particular, we're all mortal. If you find somebody who changes that, let us know. And so that should be a much more important issue than, I don't know, how sort of different we are, which is also an issue, by the way. It's not like it's unimportant, or it's just a rhetorical way to claim it doesn't matter. It does matter a lot. Being different matters a lot under every aspect, even probably a racial one. There's no doubt about that. It means something anyway. It can't be hidden, right? But it also doesn't have to be sublimated as something that is just a product of the fall. And so it's human, it's not divine, right? Excuse me, I drink a little. Even if racial differences truly corresponded to an absolute quality, the fact that you're still mortal, again, surpasses that exceedingly. And it's all what it's all about, really. Then, last section. I really enjoyed this one because it's really... these are topics I never discuss, and I know that probably they're going to cause controversy or whatever, but it's also a matter of completeness. There is surely more to discuss. Russia, Sovietism, and Orthodoxy. The question says, I cannot help but to notice the rise of Orthodox nationalism in the West. Depends what you mean by the West. I understand it because I already read this, but let's see it better again. Whilst the source of its spread maintains a strong Soviet nostalgia. And that should tell it all. The very man who mourns the fall of a vast communist dominion erects a statue of Tsar Alexander III. And yeah, that's called being a lesser person without any trace of education or identity or culture whatsoever. That's exactly the point. They venerate the cross whilst waving the hammer and sickle flag every November the 7th. And yeah, that if you have the palest idea of what that means, merely like a symbol of transcendence, of divine transcendence, of something that subordinates the means of humanity to the means of production, well, yeah, that's also what it means to be a lesser person. This bizarre rebranding of Russia as a new Israel in the face of the decadent West has for some reason wiped from memory the Bolshevik roots of modern Russian statehood. Westerners have bought into this propaganda and flocked to the ruins of a decaying state. Well, I would also at this point not be too subject to the current winds of propaganda. I mean, first of all, let's be honest, things have changed substantially. Like, these are, as I said before, fashions. They're not, again, better than neo-paganism or black centrism or all this garbage. It's all, again, lesser people trying to find a vent involved for being lesser people, except that does not work, right? Say better, I wonder, what does Schwerpunkt think about Russian Orthodoxy being exalted whilst their Soviet past is glorified? After this, I'm not sure whether to continue this part before end. Well, first of all, I believe that if we are making orthodoxy at the center of all, because it seems to me that it's not much about Russian orthodoxy. It's more the appeal to the idea that there is something countering the West. And of course, Russia, to an extent, it mixes with it, but orthodoxy is this more subtly and slimy excuse for it most of the times. But it still appeals to the fact that orthodoxy has, of course, a traditional value, and as such is something that can be taken more seriously even by people who objectively know nothing about that. And think I've experienced it myself on Schwerpunkt, that people sometimes, like, trying to act pseudo-intellectually sophisticated with me, sort of came by and said, make all these historical speeches about the channel is great, etc. What do you think about Orthodox? Because I was I was raised Protestant, but now I converted to Orthodox, and it's always the same BS. It's always kids in their early 20s. I mean, they don't have their prefrontal cortex solidified. Yeah, it's completely normal, right? When I was younger, I also bought into Russian propaganda, Putinism, etc. I was never like a fan, or in general I understood very well the shady background of that. But let's say it's not even like I hate Russian culture per se. I was, in my adolescence, I read lots of Russian classics. I have at home at another apartment my a shelf dedicated to them, together with other things. I mean, I'm mostly today, I don't really look at that as the answer to my thing. I'm very critical of Dostoevsky, but there is all that. Now I'm past. At the time, I didn't even read that, but just to boast some kind of literacy in front of girls, or trying to think that there was something deep into that. Of course, I enjoyed that, but I'm sure that if I reread everything now, I would also have, sort of different ideas, right? But here is also specifically about the Soviet legacy and everything. Well, I would say that if we want to put this all together, it's mostly Russian propaganda. I mean, as I said before, lesser people feel always disgusted by themselves. I mean, they're perfectly aware of that. So what they will do is always making up this fantasy, this fabrication, where they're actually trying to be socially accepted, right? And so they started magnifying their stuff. I don't know if you ever talked with, the interested people here, but they literally are sort of cerebrally rewired in ways that do not work. All right, you speak. These people probably see, but what is Western identity? If somebody has paranoia, lying, and passive aggressiveness are their sole national identity, like, they can't work as. Let's not say too much, because it's still YouTube after all. But let's say that's where you fully understand that at some point the West ends, that the light ends, that divinity ends, and that there is the abyss, that is the darkness. There is really bad stuff, right? And so it's obvious that the Soviet past is something to be extremely ashamed of to begin with. I mean, who wouldn't be? I mean, we are ashamed also, I don't know, our fascist past, our Nazi past. It's normal. It's before also we were talking about slavery to an extent. Every country has its own layers and of sort of, look at what we were at some point. And in some ways, it's difficult perhaps to fully explain it. I mean, as a country from a fascist past, for example, it's very tempting sometimes to adulterate all the sort of absolute disdain or rejection of canceling of any kind of thing that came from that past, to simply say, okay, this is where the worst of all. Then you look at the Soviet Union and say, wow, why is communism even legal, right, in certain Western countries? It's a deep problem, and that's where you realize that it's this sort of joker, this sort of eternal child that tries to, and child/animal, like Kipling, like in this description, that tries to be accepted and constantly fails, because just is a direct emanation of that world. So this is more or less what I really think. If you're talking about orthodoxy, I made multiple videos about this. I don't remember if one was actually asked by, no, I don't know, you weren't, but let's say, I think I thoroughly demonstrated that the notion that the Byzantine world was this hyper-advanced civilization that many people fall into as a notion today, compared to the West, and explicitly against the West in a self-sabotaging operation nowadays is complete myth. All right, if you look at the spread of Orthodoxy, it's spread among the underdeveloped. It's spread in the Balkans. It's spread in Eastern Europe. It's spread in Khazaria, for goodness sake. What was Orthodoxy at the peak of the great medieval civilization, and even later? Not even 1/4 of Europe, first of all, and by far the least developed. So what are we really even looking at? I mean, this is not a matter of exceptionalism in the midst of some bigger systems. It's literally just being a backwater of Europe, remaining highly fractal. Before we were talking about Bosnia and all the issues of the Balkans, in areas that are self-evidently lacking something. And it's not just even material wealth at some point that can simply fix the thing. So again, I don't really see what kind of fascination can be with Orthodox, if not, as it happens with undereducated people trying to idealize something that you don't know anything of. The first indicator you're an ignorant is when you pretend that something is the most beautiful thing because you've never really been there, just like women who want to, after all, date a guy from, an immigrant because, they're open and minded, when they get raped and killed. Like, that's the same exact identical mechanism, right? So the question goes on, it says, after the Soviet Union realized they could not fully eradicate the church from society, of course, because you can't, especially if you're a communist, they instead made it an extension of the state. Yes and no, at least in communistic times. How was the Russian church, and not even today, church changed from being under the control of the Tsars, remodeled into a Soviet institution, and now still existing as a bastion of Russia? So it's all BS. Like, Russia is a strikingly atheistic, anti-traditional, underdeveloped, ignorant, materialistic, deterministic, paranoid, rape high, divorce high, substance abuse high, slavery high, hellhole, that we all can absolutely describe at the simple level of any macroscopical indicator you can take into consideration. And essentially people being too underschooled to even know what they're talking about anything concerning it, if they have anything positive to say about the war. There is always, as I said before, always some positivity elsewhere. It's not like all Russians are monsters or the country just completely disgusting or whatever. But in comparison to us, like anyone who's trying to make the point that, Russian life is good. Like, you have never talked with a Russian. And the interesting thing about Russians is that they're very open about the hellish reality that they live in. They're perfectly aware of that. It's not like that. Some tend to sort of mask it, but even when they do, that there is another side that is denouncing that. They're perfectly aware of it, and they're very well, in this sense, also aware of the fact that the rest of the world lives, at least the West lives better than them, and that in general, even if they also recognize they have something good going on here and there, that's absolutely and systemically not comparable to anything we have in the West by standard. So it's absolutely ridiculous. By the way, the country is overrun by Islamic immigrants, and population, by the way, hates the Russians, the ethnic Russians. And again, every possible indicator that people claim to be something going better in Russia than we do, it's complete nonsense. It's a complete fabrication. And the church, to answer the question, is just the same thing. It's just like a toy. I talk with, again, really lots of Russians in my life, and many of them do not even seem to understand what religion is. I talked to some Eastern Europeans that literally asked me, but what's the difference between Christianity and Islam? Or, I don't know, to me are all the same because I don't know anything about them. Or, and this is very generalized, a hatred towards the church. Actually, in post-socialist countries, that one of the single most characteristically common tropes is the fact that the church is corrupted as much as politics is corrupted. And so this comes also from what you just said, that there was something, going up, side to side with the state, with the regime, which unitly also doesn't make it quite of a church. Like, the I don't even need to make specific examples, but if you know who runs the Russian church, you're probably aware also the background of the person, by the way. And we could digress on this, but definitely I don't think that the Russian church sort of ever had much of substance even before. In many ways, it had always been tied to policy. It was something actually near an Orthodox rule, that the church was treated like garbage by autocratic rulers, just like in Constantinople, and nothing to do with how the church was handled in the West by any of the polities. So it's actually very difficult. And that you wonder before you ask, how could we improve by studying ecclesiastical history? So, well, if people even just knew anything about actual ecclesiastical history, which they don't even probably suspect even what it is about. Probably they think it's some sort of history of theology or something like that. That's important too, but they just literally do not know what it is. I doubt that any relevantly identifiable amount of, for example, Americans today has any idea of what ecclesiastical history actually is, or even remotely as an idea or ever. Surely it's practically impossible to access it anywhere in the United States in the current state. In any case, going on with the question, so I don't answer the question, as a matter of fact. So it's hardly a bastion of Russian identity. I don't think that the Russian church has basically now anything to do with Russian identity. Atheism is shockingly high in Russia. It's just common life of people is completely detached from that. All right. The question goes on is, how did the government reconcile the existence of Christianity in a communist society before it fell? It didn't. They basically tolerated it. They let it, like everything in these regimes, everything is behind closed doors is tolerated. Incredible perversion, corruption. That's the parallel system that must exist, by the way, to run anything, because a communist state cannot work by definition. So it was all a great clientery private system, and behind the doors, prostitution, gambling, everything, corruption. It's constitutive of the identity of these people. It's always been like that. I have anecdotes personally that would be quite shocking. I will talk about this, also family histories about this. Now, continuing the question, considering that the average Russian, like most lay people elsewhere, is largely unaware of their own history, how viable is the Soviet Orthodox narrative as means of maintaining national morale? Probably not very relevant. You see, when I say that each government exists only because it has the decisive moral majority of the people, people like the Russians is almost morally irrelevant. They do not have power. They've been traumatized into blind subjection. Like they are being trained just to obey, to mind their own business, to have their own pool of abuse in that backdoor kind of situation, and never question anything. Who runs what? So the problem is, to them, it's just if the system runs in very materialistic terms. The rest, they don't care about anything. The Soviet Orthodox narrative is just even there for some sort of nationalistic fringe that is often amplified by the propaganda, but that has no value because, again, as you said, they don't even know their own history, completely nothing. But I mean, Russian education is a joke. Sometimes people think, oh, look, Russians educated large amounts of people, they're so advanced, they have so many engineers. Russian, again, have you ever talked with a Russian? Do you actually know what their schools work like? Do you have the palest idea of what the equivalents of their own degrees are to us? It's zero, right? It's more like anecdotes, hearsay than any kind of structural education. Whether it's complete incompetence at all levels of society. So probably the Soviet Orthodox narrative is just like an excuse. It's not basically anything more than a populistic slogan. It's just, if this thing is Russian, is ours, and you can associate communism with orthodoxy only because you're so ignorant that you don't even know how that is impossible. So again, it has by definition no value whatsoever, right? Finally, what are your thoughts about many men in the West gaining enthusiasm for orthodoxy solely to oppose the rising tides of wokeism? It's complete BS. Like, it's, again, there are some conservatives that even say that it's better to be converted to Islam than to atheism. So good luck with being a conservative or right-winger or traditionalist, for that matter. I don't think even it's about wokeism. I mean, wokeism can be absolutely countered by lots of other things. I mean, you could be Christian, as many Americans are, countering wokeism, even though they don't really know much about Christianity themselves. It's a bit that same kind of, it's mine, so it has to be protected, whatever. I think that orthodoxy is specifically, sympathized for by people who want to use some sort of pseudo-historical narrative to support their own allies, that they're flirting with Russia, which is also a form of provocation in and of itself. These are some kind of cosplayers. They're not really. It's not like they would really ever want to live in Russia. Some went living there, and they sent them to the front in Ukraine. It's very funny. And we all hope that it ended like it did. By the way, that's always fun indeed. Thus, I think that there is no deeper reason for that. It's just poor education, complete lack of historical standards, total inconsistency with what you have in the West as opposed to what you can find in other countries. And if you don't know that, if you need to idolize Russia, why is Russia idolized? It's like the Nazis were idolized. All right, if this is something white-looking, even though it's full, again, of Islamic immigrants, for Russia, in that case, and it fights against, if, for example, why all this, at least at the beginning of it all, everybody was, let's say, every conservative started to say, but that Ukraine was not important, because that started under Biden. Had it started under Trump, and had Trump immediately sort of supported Ukraine, at this point, conservatives would not be doing the opposite, but they would still basically support Ukraine, would support Ukraine instead. I mean, and it's just that, right? So then you have this rise of orthodoxy and BS. I mean, it's just like, I don't know, what we said before, people converting to Islam. Why would, I don't know, black people in the 1970s in America convert to Islam, if not to, piss off Christians? You said it yourself. Is it much of a fashion? Yes, I mean, there were women, that practiced the religion of extreme compassion and tolerance, that said, Allah is everything. Islam is so cool. And then, you don't even know how they ended up, if they ended anywhere, for that matter. They're just fashions. All right, and I don't think there is any significant level of Orthodox rise, if not maybe in some, I don't know, there are lots of also Russian Americans, for example. There is think about the deer hunter, or that there is a part of the United States that can also claim that it has connections with Europe to the extent it can take sides with this or that government. Think about how Hungary was transformed in some sort of heroic country. Why? Because they oppose immigrants. And so the country is not what it is just because it opposes immigrants. And it's just Americans being, Americans in this sense. And I'm sorry to say that, but it's obvious. It's like people having no clue about what they talk. It would be cool if people had. That's simply it, right? So it's also with Orthodox. It's just BS, right? It's this radical ignorance in actual European history. For example, well, I could digress a lot on the Orthodox thing as far as medievalism is concerned. it seems to me that in general, like, people have forgotten the West or never really studied it well, and very much like national identities at some point obscured certain historical chapters. Like how much, for example, people are into the Varangians and Constantinople. That are relatively fringe to what was happening, say, starting from the 11th century, even before, compared to the West. How are people not obsessed with France or with Italy during the same period? Or Italy maybe just for the Roman Empire. Nobody studies the communes, or France is, the greatest monarchy out there, but, maybe there was England is cooler if I had to choose, because it's identitarism. It's not really historical knowledge. It's just living in probably ignorance, without any comparative or diachronic awareness, and presuming that your small world has to remain the small world, right? You are scared of confronting yourself with the absolute value of things, which can be achieved only through a universal knowledge, which is also the divine extent by which tradition calls us, and those very people, by the way, also back in the day, all uniformly believed in. And all of a sudden, like, of course, in trying to revive that, nobody has any clue in the 21st century who would have said, right? The question goes on. It says, at this point in the message, I would like to thank you for taking the time to read my message. I actually wanted to incorporate more subjects into these prompts, but I honestly don't know enough about them to elaborate in depth just yet. Examples include Catharism and Occitania, Israel and Judaism, Tang China Taoism versus Buddhism, India Islam and the Dharmic faiths, Ethiopia Amara is the heirs of Solomon, Tibet Buddhism and Bonism, Japan and Shintoism. Oh my God. Your vast library of knowledge is enlightening and brings, and this is beautiful, and I felt touched by this, like it says, it brings new perspectives to the way I not only view history but the world as a whole. Having grown up as a Christian in the United States post 9/11, I had exhibited a certain degree of bigotry towards Muslims, and this part is scary, rather, this bigotry, but he redeems himself, towards Muslims and the broader Middle East. I never had any significant event that made me confront these biases, as I simply grew out of my disdain for Islam. Ironically, it was actually through studying Christian history that I gained an appreciation and enthusiasm for the Ummah. That would be the community of the faithful in Islam. Byzantine history was the gateway which allowed me to study the Muslim world in a way which I could appreciate. The legacy of the Caliphate is indeed something worth learning about. I agree. And cannot be neglected if anyone wants to learn about medieval Europe. That is also true. I had grown up on knights and castles, immersed in the Western medieval aesthetic, only to know more about Eastern/Central Europe as an adult. Your YouTube channel encompasses all of these topics, but also makes me feel I have returned home with a strong emphasis on the West. And this is, really beautiful to read. It was very... it is exactly what I'm doing on Schwerpunkt. There are probably different ways to describe this, but I care about the fact that, you see, as you just said, there is a centrality of the West to an extent, and one has the center lane elsewhere. It's not like the thing changes in absolute terms in the history of the world, but it's also, in fact, not a reason to feel out of the world. And that's the reason why I also believe in universal tradition, because it's not universalism, it's not globalism, it's not whatever tries to sort of flatten everything to a unique low mold. It's about the higher possible mold that matters, and that is inherently transfigurational. So I don't think this can be achieved if you don't know the world, if you don't know what you have to unite, right? And so even though I have a strong emphasis on the West with my content, there is a reason for it aside from the personal bias, but it is also and especially because I need to cover the rest to know what the West is also about. Because if you stick just to your own place and you don't see around you, your place will have no meaning. but a fantasy one that you decide to arbitrarily give it, and that will crash with reality. If we want to redeem the world, we have to start from where it has fallen. And one can't do that if it doesn't even know this world. So that's really what I'm doing in Schwerpunkt. Very well, this video was pretty long. I could have easily made more. So there were some very good questions here. I really appreciated the wall. I realized that the effort that is put here is some sort of cathartic confession and the sort of description of certain relevant aspects of somebody's life. And I'm really glad when Schwerpunkt is able to sort of extend to these issues, because otherwise it seems like I talk about this, talk about that, but I don't take a look at the wall. Instead, I constantly do, otherwise I wouldn't do everything I do. I'm not here just to upload a video every day. All right. Very well. For today, however, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.